right, good evening. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Well, my name is John Kenyon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature organization, and it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the 6th Annual Paul Engle Prize Award Ceremony. So I usually begin a talk like this, pointing out that we're a UNESCO-designated City of Literature, the only one in the United States and one of just 20 in the world. That seems even more important to point out tonight. Political administrations may come and go, but Iowa City will always be a city of literature. Thank you. So as disappointing as the news was this morning about the United States' imminent exit from UNESCO, today is a fitting day to address that head on. For today, October 12th, was Paul Engle's birthday. And in the year 2000, it was designated in Iowa as Paul Engle Day. So there's a reason why we present this prize early in October and why we hold the Iowa City Book Festival early in October. And that reason is Paul Engle. So let me be clear, there are many people who have helped to build Iowa City's literary culture over the decades, but Iowa City would not be a city of literature without Paul Engle. We recognize Paul for many reasons. He's best known as the longtime director of the Iowa Writers' Workshop at the University of Iowa, of course, but I would like to focus tonight on the creation with his wife Hua Ling of the International Writing Program in 1967. So describing their idea to bring writers from around the world to Iowa City for a residency each fall, Paul said, "For 25 years, I brought young American poets to Iowa City. This little town surrounded by cornfields with pastures full of cattle, a state raising so much food, suddenly had more poets per capita than any of the great cities of the world." It was a crazy idea to bring poets to this little place, Paul continued, and yet I felt it is imagination that brings all men together. It isn't politics or economics or history. It's the imagination. So all writers of the world ought to come to Iowa City. Now that was what he called an even crazier idea. Still, he convinced the powers that be at the University of Iowa to take a chance, and the International Writing Program was born. As Paul said later of the program, if you're reading poetry to each other, you are not fighting each other. This notion was in large part the motivating force behind the creation and continued existence of the International Writing Program, and one could argue of UNESCO and of programs like the Creative Cities Network. If you're reading poetry to each other, you are not fighting each other. So while we can lament the turn our country has taken over the past few months toward isolationism, toward division, towards bigotry, I suggest tonight we focus instead on the ways our community is standing firm for internationalism, for equality, and for tolerance. So we do that this week as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the International Writing Program. Paul and Hua Ling's crazy idea is now an institution recognized worldwide, for the way that it bridges cultures by bringing together writers of the world, more than 1,400 of them to date. Though we are much younger as an organization, we'll have just 9 candles on our birthday cake this fall, the City of Literature seeks to do similar work and to recognize those who join us in those endeavors. Which brings me back to the Paul Engle Prize. The criteria for this prize is succinct, but it takes an extraordinary person to meet it. The prize honors an individual who, like Paul Engle, represents a pioneering spirit in the world of literature through writing, editing, publishing, or teaching, and whose active participation in the larger issues of the day has contributed to the betterment of the world through the literary arts. Past winners of this prize are James Allen McPherson, Kwame Dawes, Luis Alberto Urrea, Sarah Paretsky, and Roxane Gay. Tonight, we join together to honor our newest winner, and we do so in this beautiful space here in the Coralville Public Library. The City of Coralville has been the sponsor of this prize for the past 5 years, and we greatly value that support and partnership. So here tonight to present the award is Allison Ames Gallstad, Director of the Coralville Public Library and President of the City of Literature Board of Directors. Please help me welcome Allison.
Welcome to the Coralville Library. The word work appears 22 times in Alexander Chee's essay, My Parade, a piece about his decision to attend the Iowa Writers' Workshop and his time there. There is your work, the piece of writing you're presenting at the workshop. There is at work, where he received the phone call accepting him to the workshop. And there is simply work, the thing you must do if you want to become a writer. Talent isn't enough, Annie Dillard told Chee while he was in college. Writing is work. All three kinds of work weave a thread through Chee's career. There is the work he has produced, 2 critically acclaimed novels and countless essays and stories. There is the work he has done to support himself, from magazine editing, to waiting tables, to yoga instruction, to tarot reading, to teaching college, and the work he has done to improve the world as an activist in ACT UP. And of course, there is the work he is always doing, the writing. The thing you must keep doing, the thing that makes you a writer. Chee wrote his first novel, Edinboro, while working as a waiter. He wrote after work and on the way to and from work, and sometimes at work. It was published by a small press in 2001 and later picked up by Picador USA. His epic second novel, The Queen of the Night, was published last year. In the interim, he kept up a steady stream of essays, stories, and he taught and mentored young writers at Wesleyan University, Amherst College, the University of Iowa Writers' Workshop, Columbia University, Sarah Lawrence College, and the University of Texas in Austin. Chee's work has been honored with a dazzling array of awards and fellowships, many of which are listed in your program. The Paul Engle Prize, which he receives tonight, adds to that list. Awards recognize a writer's crowning achievements, and we are here to celebrate that tonight. But as we reflect on Alexander Chee's talent, let us also remember to honor his work, the work he has put in since that day Dillard told him talent wasn't enough. Please join me in welcoming Alexander Chee, writer, worker, and recipient of the 2017 Paul Engle Prize. Give these. This is so exciting.
Ooh.
And it has the removable Iowa with the diamond.
Oh, I love it.
It's the jacket. Oh, and on the lighter side of things. I'll take your shirt down.
Okay. Thank you so much. I've known I was going to get this. It wasn't exactly a mystery at this point. But I'm very moved to be here at last and receive it among you all, and to think about the. It's been a year of writing about my dead teachers. Excuse me. And to know that that Jim McPherson received this prize first means a great deal to me. Excuse me. Anyway, I was saying just before that last month I spent some time at the Ransom Center in UT Austin with Dennis Johnson's papers. I was writing about Jesus' son. I accidentally asked for what turned out to be like a fantastic trove of treasure, which was this kind of hodgepodge of personal things like a Snoopy card that he sent his mom for Mother's Day, and checks that she had written him, loaning him money, and the many, many letters that he wrote as a dedicated correspondent to his parents while he was a student here at the University of Iowa, first as an undergrad and then in the MFA. And Paul Engle was in so many of those letters. And it was wonderful to get these stories of the man, whether it was something like, Paul Engle is trying to find a grant for me, or Paul has been talking to an editor about me, Paul is doing X, Paul is doing Y. He was always a figure helping Dennis, who was deeply troubled at the time, struggling with his alcoholism and other addictions and personal demons. And one of my favorites is he talked about his first reading, attending his first reading as a poet, and how proud he was that he had read more poems than any of the other poets because he didn't do any patter like Paul Engle. It's just like a little dig. I think I mention it because at that moment, the way that his work mattered was visible to me in a completely different way. The way that his constant dedication to this troubled young poet had helped him become the great writer we all know him to be. And so as I think about the writers that I am helping now, I guess I wonder which one of them may become that. And, this prize helps me renew my dedication to that kind of work. So I'm incredibly grateful to you all for this acknowledgement. Thank you very much.
All right, well, we get Alex situated here. Thank you so much for those remarks. Those are wonderful. It's always great to have a different perspective of towering writers like Paul Engle and Dennis Johnson who have come through Iowa City and through this program, so thank you very much. So now I would like to welcome to the stage Garth Greenwell. Garth is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and the author of the stunningly beautiful novel, What Belongs to You, which was longlisted for the National Book Award and was a finalist for 6 other awards, including the PEN/Faulkner. Perhaps most important, however, is the fact that Garth has promised via Twitter this morning that Alex will dish with him about everything in this conversation. So we're very much looking forward to that. So Garth, please join us up here on the stage. Help me welcome Garth.
Alex, Garth. Are these on? Can people hear us?
Can you hear us? The microphone's on. I was promised we didn't have to do anything. Perfect. Thank you. Alex, congratulations. I can't think of anyone who deserves this honor more, and it's such an honor for me to be on stage with you as you receive it. When Queen of the Night came out, almost 2 years ago now, I guess, you were in Iowa City, and we got to have a conversation then about that book. And so I thought today, and you also talked a great deal about that book yesterday in a conversation with Rachel Yoder for the Failsafe podcast, which I encourage you all to listen to. So I thought today we might talk about more general things and maybe more biographical things, really going back to the beginning. I know that you spent the first years of your life in Korea, and that then you grew up in Maine. In both of your novels, the protagonist is an artist. In Edinboro, a boy soprano, and then a ceramics artist, and then Queen of the Night, a gloriously fabulous soprano. I'd like to ask you, what was your first experience of art? And when did you realize that art was where your own life needed to go?
I was obsessed with drawing dresses as a kid, and I told everyone I wanted to be a fashion designer. My mother's fashion magazines would come, and I'd take out my sketchbook and I would start drawing them. And I don't remember, I had started drawing with drawing comics, and I had a little sideline making drawings of friends' Dungeons and Dragons characters for a little while, but mostly I like to draw my own. And then I became obsessed with these dresses, and I just would draw them. And then eventually I stopped drawing them out of the magazine. I started just making up my own dresses. I think that was when I imagined that I would become a fashion designer. And my mother was really, at first, I think, quietly tolerant of the entire project. At one point, I remember she suggested, maybe I could make something that I could sell at the church sale. And I didn't think very much of that suggestion. And then somehow I think she must have, I suppose, shown them to my art teacher at the school, at the middle school. And the art teacher was overwhelmed by what she saw and decided that I had to have a show in the breezeway of the middle school, which horrified me and delighted me at the same time. And so the show went up, and all of mine, for a few glorious days, the ladies of my drawings were on display in all of their couture glory in the breezeway of Cape Elizabeth, Maine's Pond Cove School. And I remember people were really taken aback by what I had done, and I liked that. I liked that that something about it challenged their idea of me, their idea of what I could do, maybe even their idea of what a boy should be doing with his time. Certainly it was not the ordinary thing. And that was when I decided that I would try to be a visual artist, which I did for a while. My art teacher was very enthusiastic, encouraging me to do these drawings, to take courses at the local art school once I had sort of surpassed my high school offerings. And then in college, I fell asleep in a drawing class after having spent the entire night up doing drawings to make the assignment. And the teacher just would never forgive it. And so I was not allowed to enter the major, and I wrote my first short story that summer after, and suddenly was like just on a different path.
Had you always been a reader, or when did you become interested in literature?
I mean, I don't know that I would. It wasn't exactly like an interest in literature as much as it was like an attempt to like push myself inside of some book somewhere and never really come out. Yeah. My mom would have these regular conferences every year with my teachers, and they would say, Alexander doesn't really live in the real world with the rest of us. And she'd come home and she'd say, "You don't live in the real world with everyone else." And I would say, "Yes, I know." And then she'd say something to the effect of, "Well, you're going to have to." And I would say, "I'm not going to." And we would just sort of do this every year. And I think, I remember sometime in elementary school doing a book report and realizing that my teacher could not have known of every book. And so I made one up to see if I could get away with it. And then I did. So then I made another one up. And I think that was really like technically my first fiction, like a metafiction of a kind.
Yeah, right.
Book report of a book that doesn't exist. I don't know that my mom might even have a copy. Yeah, I should try to find them. But that was sort of the beginning of something that, like, I was known as an advanced reader. Librarians would allow me to check books out in the quote-unquote adult section of the library early. So, I was reading things like, I remember I went looking for, I found Cheever because I was looking for my own name. Wow. In a way, on the shelf, and I was like, "What is this? Who is this Cheever?"
He was taking your spot.
Right. Yeah. And I read the Wapshot Chronicle and the Wapshot scandal at an age when I think it just totally went right over my head. So it was those kinds of misadventures early on where I guess I was just swimming in books all the time. It was partly a way to try to escape. I didn't like Maine. I didn't like my fellow students there. I felt sort of trapped. We'd been living in Guam, and then we moved to Maine in November, and I thought, like, really? This is what we're going to do? We'd been in this tropical paradise, and there it was cold. I couldn't swim in the ocean until the next year.
Yeah.
So books were the natural shield,
Right. So as we heard, the Engle Prize honors you not just for your work, but also for your role as a leader in the literary community, as a mentor, certainly something that I feel that I have benefited from.
Thank you.
And I'd like to get you to talk a little bit about the various communities that have shaped you as a human and therefore as a writer. Starting maybe with, I know that after college and before coming to Iowa, you were in San Francisco. And in San Francisco, you became part of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP, the radical queer AIDS activist group. And I know in our conversations about the Queen of the Night that you've talked about how your experience as an ACT UP in fascinating and not obvious ways informed the writing of Queen of the Night. You also write about those experiences really powerfully in the book of essays that you're publishing next year.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you whether you feel that those years and those experiences have informed your, not just particular episodes in the novel, but instead your aesthetic more generally, by which I mean your sense of what is beautiful and what is moving in art. And if so, how?
Early on in ACT UP, it became clear that we had to figure out how to keep protesting and changing people's minds without getting arrested. Because getting arrested was too dangerous at a certain point. It also it caused any number of problems for people between, ranging from putting you at risk from police brutality to different kinds of profiling and harassment to having a record that would affect your employment later. And so we started coming up with these actions that were designed to kind of catch people off guard in a particular moment, and then in that moment, have them see something new, you know? So I remember one of them that was the most memorable to me was we created false newspaper fronts for the San Francisco Chronicle, and we called it the San Francisco Chronic Liar. And it said, 6,000 dead in the city, you know, and there was a picture of the tower in San Francisco, and it looked as if some kind of disaster had happened.
Yeah.
You know? But at that point, I mean, it's shocking to think that at that time we thought that was a lot of people dead from AIDS, but that was at that point the number of people had been affected. And that was what we were trying to get across, was like, why is it any different? Why are they being treated differently from any victim of any accident or natural disaster that would otherwise summon the sympathy of the public? And so we put those, we put a quarter in the machine. We did not steal. I think it was a quarter at the time, maybe it was 50 cents. And then we would put the newspaper fronts on each of the newspapers that were in there and move on to the next box. And we just kept doing it all morning. And I don't remember if anyone even ever wrote about it. I just remember after we were done, sitting in the car that we had used to do this and waiting. Because at that point, we'd started at around like 5 a.m. and the sun was coming up, and we just wanted to see one person react, you know. And we waited, and they like pulled out the paper and did this kind of double take, and then like examined it, puzzled, trying to figure out what was going on. We were laughing at it. And I realized that you could do that with a book, that you could do that with something you wrote, that there was a way in which I could try and turn like my entire attempt at writing something into one long sort of caper that would try to just keep finding people, catching them off guard, showing them something new, something that I wanted them to care about, and hopefully not get arrested. So that was probably the biggest impact of that, was doing that kind of activism, you know.
So I think that there's about 10 years difference in us in age. And I know that for me, coming of age as a writer in the 90s, as a gay writer, I felt very much like I was writing very much like I was writing into a void. Because where there should have been a whole generation of writers describing for me what it meant to grow up as a gay writer, all of that generation was gone. You know, it's an exaggeration to say it's a void. There are important voices that survived AIDS and wrote through AIDS, Andrew Holleran, Edmund White. But where there should be dozens and dozens of voices, there are a handful. In one of your essays in the new book, there's a line that I'm going to misquote that is something like, all of the men I had hoped to follow into the future have died. Can you talk a little bit about finding your way as a gay writer, kind of in the continuing wake of, I mean, we have a way of talking about AIDS as though that crisis is over, and of course it's not. But in the wake of the horror of the first wave of the AIDS crisis in America, can you talk about finding your way as a writer and making a place for yourself as a gay writer?
I think I was protected in part by my father's incredible belief in me as a child. And it was only many years later that I realized how lucky I was to have a Korean engineer, immigrant father who did not try to tell me what to do with my life.
And who loved opera.
Yeah, and who loved opera. Yes, and who loved opera and would run around the house in his cutoffs, getting ready to do yard work, singing from La Traviata, and laughing like it was like a really funny opera, which is not. And I think I believed I had a right to do it, which I think not everyone does. And I remember in college, Kit Reed, who died just a couple of weeks ago, she said to me, she was pretty sure that I could be the first KoreanAmerican novelist, which, if I was fast enough. And speed mattered to her a lot. And then Chang Rae Lee published his book, and then later we discovered, of course, that there were people like Young Hil Kang, who had been kind of erased by history. So I would never have been the first, but I am the first Korean-American gay author of a book of fiction. And I'm still the only one, which is kind of horrible. And if there's any of you young Korean-American gay authors, future authors in the audience, like, hurry up. So, there were ways in which, like, I came to it already kind of expecting to be the first of my kind because of the way that people would talk to me. And at the same time, I kept hoping that I wasn't. I kept hoping that there were people that I would discover. And when I went to San Francisco, I did find a kind of, incredible history of Asian Americans in the U.S., in California, that was such a relief to join as a community out there, and very quickly found my cohort of gay Asian Americans that I would hang out with. But it's true that I never. There was always this sense that that things were falling down, that something that had been built was in the process of falling apart, or had already fallen apart, and was still falling apart, and that we had so much to do, even just to try to rescue those who were affected by the epidemic, much less to even think about doing our own work. And I remember discovering the work of the Alliance for the Arts in New York that was trying to help artists with AIDS protect their legacies, because families would often come after they died and just take all the work and throw it away. put it away forever, hide it, burn it. And so there were all these kinds of erasures that were happening that all of us back then were trying to combat in various ways. So it was a strange time to think about it, but I think, through it all, I just kept thinking, like, I have to do this, and I can only imagine that it was that self-belief that was instilled in me. I remember Lee Montgomery of formerly of Tin House, who's a classmate of mine here. We were sitting here in Iowa City, having a beer, and she was like, "You just think it's all going to happen for you, don't you?" And I remember being sort of taken aback and thinking, like, I didn't. That, like, at least to my knowledge, I didn't. But I acted like I did to her, and I had this kind of sense of, like, a movement into my own future that she envied. I think that's a gift that you can get from your parents that nothing else provides. And from teachers, like Kit, telling me, hurry up, you can do this, you should do this. Yeah.
As a young writer in New York, you worked at the Gay Bookstore, A Different Light, one of your many jobs, as we heard. And you say of reading the literary heroes that surrounded you in that legendary store, and this is a quote from an essay, you say that, quote, "I hoped, like them, to find a way to fuse my work with my belief in the possibility of a better, more radicalized world." What does it mean to fuse your work with that belief, and how has it affected the writing of your novels?
I think I'm still figuring that out in some ways, but my first novel, I wanted to make a novel about something that nobody ever wanted to talk about, and I wanted it to be a novel that when people started reading it, that they wouldn't stop until they were done. And so I worked intensely hard to create a kind of urgency to it that would pull people in and not let them go until the novel was done, that they would feel impelled to follow what the narrator was saying. And it was very, very hard. I think I remember for a long time, nobody could get through the first 90 pages without really just really struggling. And that was incredibly difficult for me, and I thought oftentimes that I had made a mistake, that I was doing the wrong thing, that I was wasting my time, wasting my life. And then I figured it out, and it was all about, so much of a novel is just about when people know what they know, and how, and there was an angle of ascent, I guess you could call it, that I needed to provide, and from there, people could read through those 90 pages very quickly into the rest of the book. Once that change was made, it was a really interesting thing to discover, and so much of it was just about narrative, about like how you design a narrative, and to think that was the case was really kind of boggling, With The Queen of the Night, that was something. There was a history of, whenever people would talk about courtesans, they would always claim that they had political power, they had done these things behind the scenes. they would never tell you what. And in fact, most of the ways that people talked about courtesans was to dismiss them as decorative or ridiculous or pathetic or vain. And yet, at the same time, you know, you hear these stories of, you know, the aristocrats who would pay to like tour the apartments of a courtesan after she had died, just so they could see everything. I think probably more than a few were also after a secret or two that they wanted to destroy, to be honest. But when I found what seemed to me to be the hint of a real political plot, that's when I knew that I could try and do something, try and make the story that I felt was there into this novel. And so that's, I suppose, how that spirit became a part of that book. You know, so it is by design definitely I think a few reviewers have called it a feminist picaresque, which I kind of like. But it is also an attempt at looking at just exactly what role courtesans really did play.
You know, yesterday in your conversation with Rachel Yoder, you talked about some of the difficulties you had working on Queen of the Night, and especially with fearing in the moments of doubt that every writer wrestles with in the midst of a project. Feeling that you might in some ways be betraying your principles. And I'm using your words, your principles as an activist and a writer, in writing a 700-page novel about, as you said yesterday, a white woman from the past. You said, the person that I was at war with the writer that I was. I want to ask you, what was that war? And how was it resolved? Or if not resolved, how did you make it something useful for the writing of the novel?
So Philip Gambone, who you may remember, the writer, I think probably like 10 years ago, I saw him and he said, "What happened to you?" Like I had vanished. And, you know, and for a lot of people I'd published an acclaimed first novel and then vanished into a kind of, like people were waiting, and then I think a lot of people, every now and then I'd see a blog post of someone who's like, "I think he stopped writing, I'm not sure," which would horrify me. And then I went through a period of being what I called the boy who cried novel, you know, where I'd be like, I'm almost done with this book, and I drove everyone in my life crazy with that, including my husband, who somehow forgives me for it.
I've heard some of the battles.
Yes. You know, I think I had all these ideas for other novels, and I still hope that I'll be able to write them. You know, I have ideas for 4 that I'd like to do. So I think it was partly that it was like this thing had come in and taken over my career and was in the process of changing it into something that I didn't recognize and that I hadn't even aspired to, and trying to live with that. You know, I had felt very much the burden of being that first Korean American gay author and thinking like, okay, the next books should address this more, that there was more to write, more to say, and I still think that, and I have published a number of stories that feature the same characters that I hope to turn into one of those books that I told you about. But instead I was writing this book about opera and sopranos and courtesans. So that was the challenge, really. Like, feeling like I'd betrayed the people who had been hoping for something else. And I think that's the hardest thing to write with is the idea that someone wants something from you, you know, or even that you should be doing this versus doing that. You know, it's a kind of struggle with the ego that pretends to be a struggle with ethics or aesthetics or something else, and it really is just ego. It's just your about who you are versus who you want it to be.
I'd like to talk a little bit about your first novel, Edinboro, which has recently been reissued by Houghton Mifflin.
Which is not set in Scotland.
Which is not set in Scotland, although the Scottish city does play a role.
Yes.
Well, but I guess I'm going to segue to it via Queen of the Night, because you've said that you didn't realize when you began writing your second novel, Queen of the Night, which is set in 19th century Paris, that historical novels were viewed in certain quarters of the literary world as being in bad taste. But one of the things that I find most inspiring about your work is its indifference to the canons of supposed good taste. An indifference that I would argue is one of the hallmarks of much of the art made by queer people. Very often, when critics respond to queer art, one might think of John Updike on Alan Hollinghurst, or of any number of critics on Hanya Yanagihara's A Little Life, or of a couple of dissenting opinions that spiced the extraordinary praise that greeted Queen of the Night. In those critics, one senses, or I sense, that they are blind to a tradition, to a set of aesthetic values and gambits that stand in deliberate and defiant contrast to the aesthetics of a majority culture. It seems to me that if a critic reads Proust or James, thinking that Dickens and Hemingway exhaust the possibilities of the novel, that critic is reading them wrong. So I've warned you that this is coming. I'm going to ask you and everyone in the audience to indulge me for a minute. I'm sorry if it embarrasses you. I just reread Edinboro, your first novel. I read it when it first came out in 2002, when the very excellent poet Carl Phillips put it in my hand and said, and this is the only time he has ever said this to me about any book in the 20 years that I've known him, "You have to read this right now." I wasn't a fiction writer then. I was doing an MFA in poetry at Washington University in St. Louis. And I read novels without a thought for novelistic craft. I read them for the pleasure they gave me, and I read them for the beauty of their sentences. Those things obviously made me a perfect reader for Edinboro. I remember how overwhelmingly moved I was by it. It had an effect on me that I've never forgotten. As I know is true for a great many gay writers my age and younger, it was a landmark in my life as a reader and as a writer. Rereading it now, several years after beginning to write fiction, I felt a different kind of astonishment. I think it's a masterpiece. And it seems to me that it throws out a great many of the rules of well-written fiction as conceived by contemporary realist American fiction, which often, though by no means always, tends to be the kind of fiction emphasized in the workshop. There are moments, especially late in the book, where the sentences dissolve to something approaching pure poetry, almost free of signification, like passages of Juna Barnes or Gertrude Stein. The prose insists on laying claim to registers of ecstasy and of abjection, more or less precluded by the standards of realist American good taste. Dream and hallucination figure heavily. Image and symbol have structural roles more or less equally weighted with the cause and consequence of realist plot. And as is also true of The Queen of the Night, realism is strained almost, but not quite, to the breaking point by a use of coincidence that deliberately and I think gloriously suggests the deep symmetries of Gothic narrative, of opera and of fairy tale, and of myth. So to bring it around to a question, after a little essay, sorry. Yesterday in your conversation with Rachel, you talked about Edinboro being, quote, explicitly gay fiction, by which I take you to mean as addressing explicitly gay subject matter in a way that Queen of the Night doesn't. But to what extent, if any, do you see these elements that I've talked about in both of your novels as marking them out as participating in a queer literary tradition, as I do? That presumes an earlier question, which is, do you believe in such a tradition? And if so, how important is it for you?
Well, that is a question. I'm just going to bask a little bit. I mean, it's funny because when I set out to write Edinboro, I thought I was going to write what I, at the time, called like just another shitty autobiographical novel, because I was so disgusted by. I tried to go to publishers with a more ambitious, unfinished novel and stories, and it seemed like it wasn't going to go anywhere. And I was young and cynical, and I thought, well, okay, I'll just write about myself. How hard could that be? Really hard was the answer to that question. And I think the first thing that I had to get rid of was myself. You know, I had to kind of pull my what I think of as my relationship to myself out of the book as it was developing, and really let that narrator be a character with his own fate and not mine. And once I did that, I think it was much easier to write the novel, although it still took an incredibly long time. I think I told some interviewer when Edinboro came out that I would never take 7 years on a novel again. So I took 15 instead. True, exactly. And it is like 2.5 times, Queen of the Night is 2.5 times as long, so the value is clearly, you know. I think, you know, it's funny that you and I have talked about taste before, good taste, bad taste, this question of like what's in bad taste, and the question of who decides, and its relationship to queer fiction. And I think you have to be willing to be in bad taste to even come anywhere close to being in good taste. That you simply have to not fear it. That I think fearing being in bad taste as a writer will keep you in this kind of really dull place, you know, that for me it was never the point, you know. I think the sorts of fireworks, I guess, that you're talking about, those were incredible pleasures to create. You know, the writing of them was incredibly pleasurable, such that I became suspicious of it, and then eventually certain of it. You know that. But I remember when I figured out the plot for Edinboro, I do remember thinking like I would be chased through the street and attacked. You know, that people would hate me, and I think writers are always fantasizing that they'll have some greater reaction to their work than actually happens. No one chased me. And I think yes, that is a unifying quality, I think, in both novels. I think of The Queen of the Night as Baroque, for sure. And I'm thinking of my mother showing it to a friend of hers who opened it and then closed it and said to her, "Well, he sure likes to describe things." Which is such a main, like it's such a, it's like right out of an Elizabeth Strout novel. And so yes, I like to describe things, and that was always the point. I don't know. I do remember one review on a blog. Of course, always the negative things haunt you, right? Yeah. Never the positive. Some guy saying like, "Oh, this is such MFA fiction," about my first novel, and I was just like, "Oh my God, I'll come down to Florida and kick your ass myself," because I really didn't feel like that was what Edinboro was, and I was proud of that, So I'm not sure if I am answering this question. I hope I am, but I think, so much of that strikes me as an accident that I then allowed myself to entertain, and then once I entertained it, shaped it, and so on. Edinboro was not at all the book I set out to write, but it became the book I wrote, Queen of the Night also. And I don't know, we'll see if I ever get down to realism.
No rush.
Right. But, I think I've been interested in it recently in a different way. I think that, for a while, there was an early movement in the 20th century, late 19th century, by critics to wed American realism to the idea of America. Yeah. That it was like patriotic to write realist fiction. And I think it has always been a default. When you study fiction writing, it is the default mode that people teach you. And I think that's a mistake of a kind. So I try not to teach that. I try to teach my students to see all of the ways there are to tell stories and to try to make a bigger space in the process. Because I think that there are things that realism can't describe yet, at least, that are the reason that we have these other modes, and that's why we love them and write them.
What you say about sort of the writing of both of your novels emerging from accident and not from intention, seems to me true about really any kind of art making I can imagine. And, we live in a moment where we are feeling a great deal of political urgency. And I know that every artist I know has fallen into what seems to me like it may be a trap of conceiving of relevance in a kind of narrow or one-to-one way. or of thinking of what it would mean to make meaningful art in this moment in a kind of stripped down way. I had promised myself that we wouldn't talk about Trump because, one of the, to me, one of the most tragic things about the moment we're in is that it feels almost impossible to talk about anything else. And that kind of every cultural discussion has to come back to this figure. I mean, it's as though, everything has been colonized, which I think is kind of an intention. But I am, because you are so committed to activism, and also so committed, it seems to me, to a sort of very aesthetic conception of art. A conception of art that does have at its center beauty. Beauty which is always, I think, a kind of surplus value. I mean, beauty which is, in some sense, always a grace because it's never necessary, or is necessary because it doesn't serve any obvious purpose. How do you think, in your own work, or in the work of your contemporaries, or in the work of your students, what do you think the role of art is, or can be, in a moment like the one we're living in?
It's important to remember that Republicans love a novel. It might be The Fountainhead, but they do love it.
They do love it.
They try to act like they don't need the arts, but the company that makes one of those so easily hacked voting machines in Michigan is on John Galt Avenue for a reason, because Republicans love a novel. So the question is, can you write a novel that could change the world? Yes, people do that all the time. It may not happen as often as we want it to, but it does happen. And the question of whether it will be you or someone else, maybe the world you change is just like the world of 3,000 people. But who knows what they'll do? And that's the thing that you have to keep in mind, is that so much of what the thing that you write may not do the thing that you want in the world, but it does something, and you don't get to know what that is, and yet you still have to believe it matters, and that's the place to live next to as this stuff sweeps over us, because otherwise the whole thing stops, right? And that's the greater than any censorship would be if people just stopped writing for believing that there was no purpose to it, and if they stopped reading because they felt there was no purpose to it, and if they stopped seeing each other at literary events like this, events like these are how I've been surviving and thriving since the 80s. Seeing the people who matter to me, seeing the work that they do, experiencing it, and I think the sort of I know what you're talking about with the idea of a narrow relevance, that is its own kind of risk, Most of the people I know who had books coming out this year felt themselves suddenly to be in an entirely different context and unsure if the work made even any sense at all. People were trying to revise books that were already on their way to production. A sort of mania that was easy to feel and sympathize with, that I also, felt myself have to figure out, my relationship to, is like, yes, the country that we thought we were going to live in is not the country that we live in. And yet the country that we live in is the country we were always living in at the same time. It's that weird paradox. And maybe that's the place we have to make art for. So that's how I'm thinking about it.
I think that might be a good point to open things up to the audience. Alex, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Soon. So we are being taped here for Choral Vision, and so I would ask that if you have a question for either Alex or Garth, or both, that you would just raise your hand, we'll call on you, and if you could just stand up and say it loudly and succinctly, so that either I or Alex can repeat it so that it can be heard for those watching the broadcast later, then we'll let them answer. So do we have any questions from the audience? Anything anyone would like to ask? While you're thinking of questions, I would like to point out on the prize, so the prize itself, the piece of art, is something that was created by Lizzie O'Neill, who is an artist at MC Ginsberg. Each year we have worked with an artist with MC Ginsberg to create a one-of-a-kind piece of art. So there is a little representation of the state of Iowa on the back of that Alex may be looking at right now. That is consistent across all of the 6 pieces of art, but otherwise they are all unique and individualized to the author that has won them. So I just wanted to say thank you to Lizzie for that piece of art that she has created, inspired by her own reading of Alex's work. So while I was talking about that, did anyone think of any questions they would like to ask? You were intimidated by the quality of Garth's questions, weren't you?
Well, I know that Brandon Taylor has a question.
Oh.
I'm looking at him right now.
Oh. Okay, I guess I have a question. Hi, Nick Cam. I guess my question is, when it comes to shaping difficult or messy material in fiction, and how one thinks about doing that, especially when you're maybe writing about difficult, painful people in your family that you love and you want to really get right.
So the question is, with difficult or painful autobiographical material, how do you shape that into something that can be used in fiction? Is that fair?
I think you have to really make it fiction. You have to make people like the people, but who are not the people. That you have to change something in these characters so that you can really give them a different life from the one that you are writing from. And I know it's very, so there's a number of difficulties. One is the event means something to you. You're sure that it means the same thing to other people. It may not. You may write it in the way that you remember it, and the readers will have very different reactions. If you write it the way it happened to you, you are often writing it in what Aristotle would call the historical truth and not the poetic truth of the narrative. So you're detailing things that happened, but there's no sense of why it happened to this particular character at this particular time in the same way that it might in something that was invented, and that works through a feeling of trying to create a narrative that feels inevitable. If in some ways, if you're trying to write about something painful that happened to you, and you're trying to make it seem inevitable, that's almost too awful to think about. And yet that's actually exactly the kind of thing that you do have to do. And to see that truth, you do need that distance that you can only create when you turn those figures into people who have even even a hair's difference from yourself. So that's what I know for how to do it, how to approach it, because I think otherwise it's just too hard, because the sacrifice of describing it anyway is so hard. You want it to mean something more. You want it to be bigger than just what happened to you. You're trying to take this thing and make it into something that can speak to other people about the things that have happened to them or that might happen to them. And that's the space that it has to live in, because you as a writer have to feel free to do whatever you can to it. And if you're shaping it according to what happened to you, you fall into what I call the trap of what happened, where you're assuming that the verisimilitude required to convince a reader emerges just from the fact that it did happen to you. And that's not, sadly, that's not enough. It's a terrible thing to write fiction. No one should do it unless they have to. But it's good to try. Someone will be glad you did. Yes?
Well, would you describe how James Allen McPherson influenced you?
Yes. He was a tremendous influence on me. Oh yes, he asked, would I describe how James Allen McPherson influenced me? Sorry. And he was the first winner of this prize, and he was my teacher here at Iowa in 92 to 94. And he was mysteriously at the Whiting ceremony when I won, which suggested that he had some role in my getting the Whiting that year, which was an enormous pleasure to me to see him there, because in many ways, the work that I do because I had him as a teacher. And I took a class with him where we studied Heinrich Zimmer's The King and the Corpse, which is a book that he taught for many years at Iowa, I think, to a lot of us. It was a seminar on how to work with myth and the features of myth. And it was there that I understood that my longtime fascination with myth and fantasy was actually a fascination with structure, and in particular the way in which myths provide you information about the rules of the world. And so that in some ways a fascination with myth is a fascination with those rules. So, with Edinboro I was trying to hack myth, and with Queen of the Night also. And the impulse to do that came from studying with him. So I owe him an enormous debt that I feel very strongly.
Maybe time for one final question.
So you talked about your activism with ACT UP and that very creative and energetic changing of the newspaper. What's comparable to that now? I mean, are we all just so dismayed that we have no creative spark left in our protest? Or am I just missing it?
I think a lot of so there's a lot of protests happening on social media, right? Which has a limit, because you have to be on social media to experience it. But I think a lot of creativity is certainly on display there. I think there's, we're looking at a new generation of activists, and they are looking to models from the past. They're looking at ACT UP, they're looking at street theater, they're looking at, the there was a group that rented a massive video screen to play the Access Hollywood tape in front of the White House on the 1-year anniversary of, and to play it for like 17 hours, you know. But I think that, you know, I think what we're realizing is that we need, in some ways, we need some of the really just basic civic stuff in a way that activism can't quite, you know, there's activism, but then there's also like, did you vote for the school board? Did you do any voter registration? Did you drive people to polls? Did you make sure that people, if ID is required now, did you work with them to get IDs? Did you, like, there's all these civic things that we need to go back to that I think a lot of us have let slip, you know, because local power is a lot of power. There's a lot of power in our communities and just in talking to each other. And so I think that while those kinds of things that I'm talking about matter in terms of changing hearts and minds and perceptions, that there's also this other thing that it's clear that was in place maybe back then that is not so much in place now that also has to happen. I think a lot of people are realizing that is a part of activism now as well. And I've seen, someone was commenting like about, you know, the resistance. They were saying like, I don't know, a lot of the stuff that people are calling resistance just looks like basic civic responsibility. And, you know, and if you have to think of yourself as a rebel to go to that school board meeting, then great. Like, do it. Put on your beret and your mask or whatever's gonna get you there and drive down and like sit on that school board or vote for the person you will. It's a different kind of thing that I think, you know, every political moment has its own needs, and reading that is so much of figuring out what the right response is.
All right. Thanks to you two gentlemen for that. Help me to congratulate Alex once again, and thank you, Stu.
Thank you.
So our friends at the Coralville Public Library and their foundation have set up a reception for us afterwards, so please stick around and join us. Our other friends at Prairie Lights are selling Alex's books there, and I know he will be happy to sign those for you. So please stay with us, and thank you very much for coming out. We have 3 more days of the Iowa City Book Festival to go, so hopefully you all grabbed a program when you came in, and you could mark that up and figure out how you're going to join us for the rest of the week. So thank you again for coming out, and again, thank you very much to our friends at Coralville for hosting us. Thanks.